I'll just let him take it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Is that the right one? That's the right one. Okay. I love that this got written on because I was going to. This was going to be part of the whole beginning here. But what's interesting about it for me, I mean, what I want to do in the hour that I'm going to be talking with you is frame a story and then talk about what an alternative story might be. And that story has to do with what we live in this world that we call Earth, particularly in the area of how we do business. And business is transacted everywhere in every culture. So there's a story about that, and it's a story that I think is changing, and I think it's one that we can actually quicken the change for some very good reasons. But, you know, Lisa, I loved this, and I'm stealing this, by the way. So out of the story, we develop a philosophy, and out of the story comes our physiology. And Jim may be the fastest, but I am certainly the sloppiest chart writer that I've ever met. And then we have psychology that comes out of this. So out of the story, all three of these domains are actually impacted. And we look at the world today, and the world has a philosophy about how business is conducted and what it's supposed to be and what it's supposed to enable. I'm going to posit that that's not a healthy place. As a matter of fact, in my experience, every organization I've ever worked in is toxic to the human spirit in some way, shape, or form. Wow. Everyone. And I've really met very few that are not. And those are generally startups where there's a lot of juice. But that quickly dispels as it starts growing. Every organization has a physiology. And you can feel it when you walk in the office or the building. There's just this feel about it. I walk into Microsoft and it's kind of like, God, I want to contract. I walk into Google and I feel like I can breathe. It's different. And there's a psychology. I talk about toxicity. There's a case that can be made that almost every corporation on the planet today is sociopathic. And that's going to be kind of interesting. So, oops, there we go. As we look at compassionate capitalism, I'm going to kind of blah blah here for just a little bit because I want to set a foundation. In deference to Freeman, Freeman kind of took me aside here and said, it's after lunch, you need to get them up and moving before you start. I'm like, no, I'm going to talk to them and put them to sleep and then we'll get to move a little bit here. Compassionate capitalism. And we've lived with it. It's kind of like fish and water. You know, we've all had an experience of business, but we really, in my experience, have not taken a lot of time to look at what the water is that we actually find ourselves swimming in. So I want to just kind of posit a couple of things here and then kind of look at some stuff here. Came across this quote, and it just kind of framed for me what the present story is about capitalism. As we look deeper for the soul of capitalism, we find that in terms of ordinary human existence, American capitalism specifically doesn't appear to have one. In the economic sphere, efficiency trumps community, maximizing returns comes before family or personal loyalty, and what seems priceless in one realm may be wasted freely or even destroyed by the other. And when you look at just kind of how resources are experienced and utilized on this planet in service of business, this thing really echoes strongly. I led Nokia's global, those of you that are familiar with telecom, I mean, Nokia is now on a decline. But when I was working with them, I led their global leadership initiative for about 12 years in partnership with the London School of Economics and a good friend of mine that was a professor there. And this is back in the early 90s when they were still selling rubber boots. And Nokia's 134 years old. And when they started migrating into telecom, they still had rubber tires. They were conglomerate, very regional. And Jorma Ollila bet the farm on telecom. And the rest was history. I mean, they actually did some incredible things. And one of the things that served them very well in those early years as they were moving was, and this is not an exaggeration, every single meeting I attended with their folks over a 12-year period began with a conversation about how are we using our values to help enable these decisions that we're making today. Every organization I've ever worked with has a vision and value statement. And when I've asked most of them, what are they go, hold on just a minute. Yeah, it's here in my wallet, a little card, I'm sitting on it. And that's really what was going on with most vision and most values in most organizations, is they were being sat on. They weren't being brought to life in any way, shape, or form. They were oftentimes artwork on the wall, those sorts of things. Nokia was a little bit different. And Nokia was a very exciting place to work for and with for 12 years. And as an external consultant, to be able to lead their leadership process, the development of it for 12 years was fascinating. And it changed from the time that they began work with us and we began work with them to, when I finished, they went from a third-tier player, literally, to the dominant gorilla in the marketplace in the span of about an 8-year period. Phenomenal growth. Now, where that leads to is a question that I'd like to ask you. What if I told you that capitalism as it is currently conducted is toxic to all life on the planet? I love Sam Horn here. Okay, this is a little tip of a hat to her on this. And these questions. Yeah. Just think about it. What if I told you that was true? How would that, here's how I want you to, I'm going to shape your listening a little bit. As you listen to this, particularly this front end piece, think about your own business. None of us in this room run global conglomerates. Some of us interact with them, but we're all either solopreneurs or entrepreneurs in some way, shape, or form. How does your business actually get run? And when you're paying attention to things, what are you paying attention to? What if I told you that there's an emerging business paradigm that has the potential to transform the human experience? Literally, the human experience. What we have today is an experience as human beings that is predicated in a large way by the way that we conduct business on this planet today. One of the things that is just fascinating, all of you have heard this phrase, our people are our greatest resource. How many of you have heard that? Our people are our greatest asset. What do you do with resources in an organization? Use them. You use them. So just think about this. Yeah. You're a great. I can't wait to use you. Okay. What do you do with assets on a balance sheet in an organization? Depreciate them. Our people are our greatest resource and they're our greatest asset. We're going to use them and depreciate them. And we do. And we do. It's a function of the model. Okay? The emergence of this new paradigm requires leaders schooled in transformational technology. Transformation. This isn't going to be a sequential iterative process. It will require a fundamental shift in the way that we think and hold what business is. And that is a transformation. It really is a transformation. And Terry's comment about you don't learn in your comfort zone. You don't. It will require people getting uncomfortable and leaders that know how to school people and shepherd them through that period of, oh my godness. Okay? The other question here, and I'm going to come back to this, what if I told you that the future of business is making the future its business? And if that's not your focus, you will soon be out of business. Okay? We have to be thinking of our future. Now, short history of modern capitalism. This is where we kind of examine the water a little bit. We can go all the way back to Athenia and Aristotle, and I'm not going to do that. This is a short history. Okay? But I do want to just capture a couple of high points here. One, Adam Smith, early 1700s, wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. What he postulated was, and this is coming out of some mercantile work, the trading structures and organizations that were going on with the crown, but the postulation here was people will trade with each other because there's a benefit to each other in doing so. And if I'm taking care of making sure that you have benefit in this trade, we're probably going to be pretty well off. It was called enlightened self-interest. And from Adam Smith's point of view, that was the invisible hand, that enlightened self-interest that kind of guided the way the business was transacted. Okay? And it translated to the wealth of nations. Okay? Now, that got a little bit screwed up down the road. And I screwed up is my technical term for it. But Ayn Rand, back in about the late, early 60s, I guess, wrote a couple of books, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. And she had a very interesting political philosophy as well as a capitalist philosophy. Capitalism is the only morally valid socio-political system because it allows people to be free to act in their rational self-interest. Now, this is a fundamental shift. This is a fundamental shift. Mutual benefit, enlightened self-benefit, rational self-interest. Okay? Selfishness begins to come into play here as an attribute and as a value. Okay? And this was kind of capped later on in the 60s by this fellow, Milton Friedman. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profit. And this was widely read and literally became part and parcel of the fabric of the way business is conducted. And a major shift began to occur, particularly in publicly traded companies, towards a focus on short-term quarterly results. And that was a direct consequence of the way a lot of this stuff was framed. Okay? Focus on short-term profitability. And the measure of an organization's success was, how much money did you make? Okay? How much money did you make? Not how much did you distribute, how much money did you make, brought in, kept. The history of capitalism is basically defined in one word here, accumulation. Accumulation. And it's resource accumulation, monetary accumulation, fiscal accumulation. The one that accumulates the most wins. And that's kind of the paradigm, the background paradigm of all of capitalistic behavior. Okay? Now, I'm being very general here, very general. But that's kind of the way that the water has begun to be created, and that's what we swim in. Okay? And each one of us keeps score in that way. How much have I got today? To a significant degree, that's how the world kind of calibrates itself. Now, there's been a lot of good news that's come out of this. Capitalism has enabled some amazing things. You can't read all of this here, but population growth. We're about 6 billion plus right now. This is a measure of GDP per capita. Now, for the first 1,500 years or so of mercantile trade and transactional business, that sort of thing, there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle that moved in the GDP, and this is all kind of oriented around a static dollar. But about 1500 here, some very interesting things began to occur. This is where trade, we started expanding. Leif Erikson discovered or landed in North America. Columbus did his thing. Columbus was one of the first adventurers. And part of the adventurer philosophy, and in this you can include DeSoto and a couple of other folks, their charter was to go out and find new lands to bring back the riches to the crown. And they were chartered by the crown to do so. Okay? Bring back riches, I don't care how you do it. Basically, these were organized crime syndicates. Okay? For all intents and purposes. Go out, rape, pillage, plunder, and bring back what you can. About the time that the wars in Europe started decimating some of the treasuries, some of the crowns in Europe started moving towards what was called privateering. And privateering was basically a way of legalizing piracy. So rather than committing their own navies, they would get these privateers out there. And there were some great privateers that went out and did some fascinating things in the interest of the crown. The crown put a little bit of money in, but they weren't at risk. They were legally not culpable for what was going on. But part of the way that it worked was you got all of this money coming back into the crown. From there it migrated, and by the way, just as an interesting side note, in 1790, the Boston tax records, if you look at them, the 5 top earners in the Boston area in the 1790s recorded privateering income as a major source of their income. One of those was Alexander Hamilton. Okay? Just fascinating. Chartered corporations came into play around the early 1700s. Hudson Bay Company, the East China Tea Company, and these again were ways that the Crown, because of, we'll just take the English example. The English Crown, Parliament restricted the powers that the monarchy had. The king didn't like that a lot. So they started looking for ways that they could bring revenue back in. And chartering these organizations to do so was the way that they did that, because they could literally go around any parliamentary restriction. They'd invest a little bit of money in these chartered corporations. The Hudson Bay Company basically became, again, an organized crime syndicate. Rape, pillage, plunder, they could do anything that they wanted. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing about chartered corporations at that point was they had a finite life term. They had a finite life term. And they had a very specific mission. Once the term or the finite mission was accomplished, they were dissolved. So, what's interesting here in this particular graph is there was a lot of benefit to this in terms of GDP. Income, gross domestic product as compared to individuals. Nations were getting wealthy. Nations were getting wealthy. Capitalism and its role in ending poverty. This comes from the World Bank. 1800, and again, these are standardized 2003 dollars. 90+% of the people lived on less than $1 a day. Today, well, actually in 2003, when this was recorded, it's actually less than this now. It's in single digits. And Muhammad Yunus was recorded as saying that if it's possible in his lifetime, he will see extreme poverty as measured by this value eradicated on the planet. That is a direct consequence of business. It truly is. One of the other things that's interesting here is that, now this is an interesting one, today we live in the most peaceful time in history. You wouldn't know it by the news. You wouldn't know it by the news, but we, as a people, as a race, human race, we live in the single most peaceful time in recorded history. And the source on this, it's an interesting read, Steven Pinker, Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. If you're interested in a very, 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 very thick book, there's some fascinating data in there. Murder is 30% lower, or 30 times lower than it was in the Middle Ages. One of the major reasons here has to do with the growth of commerce. Opportunities for positive sum exchange, you win, I win, as opposed to zero-sum plunder. Okay? Okay? The good old days are gone. The good old days are gone, yeah. But it has had a distinct advantage in terms of, trading nations are not likely to fight with each other, or they're far less likely to fight with each other. So one of the reasons that we continue to look for strengthening trade ties is that there is an advantage to it here that is ancillary to the actual money that comes back in. Okay? So there's positive news here. There's positive news. There's also some interesting other things. Problem. Capitalism is based on a need for ever-increasing consumption. This is where, when you pull the covers up, you go, oops. Okay? In order to sustain the kind of growth that is called for by investors, and we'll talk about investors in a minute, you have to continue buying stuff. You have to continue manufacturing things for consumption. And it doesn't really matter what it is as long as they buy it. Okay? And it doesn't really matter what resources are used as long as you're manufacturing, because if you're manufacturing, then you can sell. Okay? It's a non-starter. Here's the reason it's a non-starter. This chart is hard to read, but it'll give you an interesting framework here. Just to preserve current GDP levels as they are today, projecting forward into 2020, at the current level, we will have to increase global debt by $200 trillion. There's only $100 trillion in free cash existing on the planet today.
Can you say why? Yeah.
Why would? Because you consume by credit. You consume by credit. Okay? In order to sustain a consumptive growth model, you have to have people continuing, which is why organizations look to move into new territories. Because if we can get new people exposed to stuff, we can get them to buy, but in order for them to buy, they have to have access to credit. Governments have to have access to credit. The reason Haiti has never been able to recover from the loan debts that they incurred in the early part of this last century is because of credit. And they tried to back away from it at one point in time, and all hell broke loose.
What's the source on this?
This was a McKinsey and
It's right there.
World Bank.
Right, source. World Economic Forum.
World Economic Forum, yes. Yep. So, fascinating piece of, there's an incredible study on this. I can get you that if you want it. Okay. Another piece here. Value creation is not part of the current model. Value creation is not part of the current model. Now, just think about that for a moment. The purpose of business is not to create value. The purpose of business is to make money. The only way we can make money is to increase consumption. The only way that we can continuously increase consumption is by increasing debt levels. It's not sustainable. The model is broken. It's not sustainable. When we look at this, the consequence literally is trust in business, trust in most of our institutions is going down rapidly. Current trust level in the U.S. government, Congress in particular, is I think right around 9%. Yeah, it's that high, huh? 9%.
In businesses or in government?
In government in particular, Congress specifically. Government, 2000 or businesses, it's a little bit below 15% right now.
In the States?
Okay. In the state. Well, this is worldwide.
Worldwide?
Yeah, just big business, big business. This isn't the mom and pop. Okay. So this is kind of background here. Why has this happened? A couple of things have happened. First of all, for the first time in U.S. history, the majority of adults were over 40 years old. Demographically, people have matured. This is an interesting statistic. Also, the median age is approximately half the countries is now over 30. There are countries where it's under 20, but the median age in half the countries in the world is over 30. The population is aging, and an aging population pays attention to different things. And they're paying attention to businesses not satisfying those different things that they're now valuing. Because remember, business isn't in the business to create value. Okay? Another reason here is that there are now over, and Jim talked about this, over 10 billion plus internet connected devices on the planet today. Now this was a 2009 figure. There's actually far more than this right now. Now when you think of the internet connection and what that allows for in terms of communication, fast communication of information, governments can't hide. Businesses can't hide. Malfeasance will show up in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, it's just axiomatic with this many connections. You can't not have people know. Okay? And the third thing here has to do with something that's called the Flynn effect, named after a researcher. Beginning back in the late 1800s, they've started looking at some data on a generation by generation basis. Our intelligence as a species is going up 10 to 20%, or 10 to 20 points each generation. We are becoming more discerning.
What does that mean, 10 to 20 points?
10 to 20 IQ points. You today are a genius compared to your ancestors of the last century. No, not the last century, the last century. The 1800s. You're an Einstein compared to them, just based on your IQ level. Okay? Now, there is an implication to that in terms of how you make choices and what you pay attention to. We're not dumb. Now, we know when we're being sold a bill of goods. The other piece of this, and this is where I love what Cynthia is doing with the Unstoppable Foundation. That's my little plug, by the way. We're better educated. As a species, again, we're better educated. Going back to 1950, the average age across the entire planet, or the average amount of schooling across the planet, was 3.2 years. Okay, that took into account sub-Saharan Africa as well as Princeton. Okay, big range here, but 3.2 years. 1980, it was 5.3 years. The year 2000, it was a little over 6 years. Impact on economic output. There's a rate of return for each additional year of schooling that ranges from 5% to 12%. Okay? So we actually are becoming wealthier. So we're looking at how do we spend our money. Okay? How are we spending our money, and are we spending it on trinkets and trash, or are we spending it on something that actually gives us a sense of intrinsic value? Okay? So that's kind of, the whole history and the water that we swim in here. So when we start looking here at why I moved to what I'm calling compassion, and I'm making a distinction between compassionate capitalism and conscious capitalism. And there is, for my money, a big difference here, a big difference. And that difference has to do with how we define compassion. Compassion is a prerequisite to consciousness. It absolutely is. I have to be in a position of knowing what's real for you. I have to be connected. Compassion is predicated on connection. If I'm going to be compassionate about the Earth's resources, or if I'm going to be conscious about the way I utilize the Earth's resources, I have to be compassionate. I have to be connected to them. Foundational to all the highest principles found in philosophy, and it's derived from the word passion, okay? Which is ancient Greek verb pashko, which means to suffer. Compassion, the passion of Christ, the suffering of Christ. How many of you, when I say the word suffer, relish the opportunity to go suffer? Not many. Why not? What's your understanding of what the word suffer means? Pain, hurt. Yeah. That is, again, the story that we hold about what suffering is. One of the definitions of suffer is to experience fully or to feel keenly. It has nothing to do with pain. It has absolutely nothing to do with pain. It's an openness to feeling what's here. And when we begin to look at this emerging new story, part of the predicate is that we have to be in a position to feel keenly what's going on with the other out there. And it's my contention that it's at that point where we are most able to connect. We connect through vulnerability. We disconnect through certainty. And we are disconnected a lot because we think we know what's going on in the minds and the bodies and the feelings of other people. In order to really connect and become compassionate and then conscious, we have to find a way to connect at that point of vulnerability. What's most concerning to you? What are you most needing? Where's your suffering in the non-painful domain? Okay? If we can do this, what that then opens up is finding a way to meet people at that point where they are feeling that. And this is when we start looking at our product offerings in a new business model. Is what you're offering designed to meet people at that point of greatest need? Not at the point where you need to sell something to get some revenue, but at the point of actual greatest need. Value creation. It's a shift from consumption and profit creation to a focus and orientation on value creation. Now, how do you define value? Everyone in this room is probably going to have a little bit different definition for it. And I'm going to offer up one that I think is actually fairly salient and can serve as an umbrella to hold all of them. And it's very simply this: all humans seek the experience of feeling fully alive. That's where value is created. It's when your product in my hand allows me to feel like, wow, God, I'm glad I'm alive. This is so bloody cool. So cool. I mean, I love this. That's value creation. We can negotiate the price later, but this is cool. Okay? Okay? And you'll set the price based on the cost of resources and all that stuff. But it's a focus on and a dedication towards and a discipline to delivering value. That's where consciousness comes into play. But it's predicated on compassion. I can't be conscious about your need unless I'm compassionate about who you are and where you are. Now, let's take a look at this. And I use Apple as kind of an iconic representation of this. I mean, their heart's in the right place, I think. I really do. Yeah, they stub their toe every now and then. But I do remember 2007, I got my first iPhone. And I about wet my pants. I mean, it was this box. I've still got the box. I've still got the box. This box was so bloody incredible. The care and the detail that went into the design of the box. I could only imagine what was inside it. And I wasn't disappointed. I was absolutely delighted to be alive that day. Absolutely delighted to be alive that day. And I was willing to pay what they asked for. I really was. I mean, Apple today is the most valuable company on the planet, and they charge a premium for every product that they manufacture. It's not an accident that they are as successful in the way that they are. Okay? Now, they still operate within a current model, but there's some things that I think that they're doing very right. BMW. I've had 4 of them. I love them. I love them. The ultimate driving machine is absolutely true. I love being alive in that car. It's just cool. Patagonia, just up the street, they're great. Costco, I mean, it's a big box. But God, they got the good stuff here. Starbucks, they actually do a pretty good job here. You know, what's interesting here, Howard Schultz is one of the only major CEOs that has come out in favor of the ACO, you know, or the Affordable Health Care Act. And it said, that's not a reason for us to not provide health care. And they provide health care to everybody that works with them. Yeah, I've met him a number of times. He's a fascinating guy. And he really walks the talk in a lot of ways. Richard Branson. It's another one.
Business makes the world go round. It has an enormous power. When employed in the pursuit of profit alone, it has had some disastrous unintended consequences. We're using the Earth's resources faster than we can replenish them. And there are 2 billion people still living in poverty who haven't profited from business at all. I'm Richard Branson, and I believe that business has the power to make the world better. But it needs a plan B, one that considers people, the planet, and profit. In fact, I believe business has to think this way in order to thrive. So I got together with my friend Jochen Seitz and some inspirational leaders from around the world, and we created the B Team. With help from the experts and our global community, we're looking for the biggest challenges that are standing in the way of making business work better. And together, we'll scale the solutions. Like finding new ways to measure the value that capital business takes from nature. Or creating new structures that reward companies for making sustainable choices in the long run. We can use entrepreneurship to help close the gap between rich and poor and redefine what it means to be successful in business. Until there's a new normal, where business creates profit for people and the planet. We're united with a single purpose. Please join us.
Yeah. Now, Jim Selman and Barnett and I are a member of a group that's called the Emerging Business Alliance, and it came out of the joint TLC World Business Academy gathering that we held earlier this year. Richard is a part of, the B Team is part of this. Ronaldo Brutico sits on the board of the B Team. There's a lot of us that are coming together to change this story. And I say us, not just the people in this room, but the invitation is now what I'm going to be offering up here. There's a lot of organizations, foundations, nonprofits, associations that are paying attention to this emerging paradigm. And that's what this new story might represent. And I'll quickly go through this because I want to have you, kind of dig into a couple of things here. First of all, just, the B Team, Clinton Global Initiative, Conscious Capitalism, Cirrus, World Business Council for Social Development and the World Business Academy, we're getting together in March next year. This is the core group. We're bringing in a number of other groups to have a day and a half conversation about how does this story get framed and what do we do? And it's not about reinventing what any of us is doing. It's about how can we collaborate more effectively and leverage what each other's doing in a more effective manner. Compassionate business. I'm just going to quickly go through this, but here's some hallmarks. It's a mission linked and ideal beyond returns. Recognition that the business and its operations aren't separate from and impact all potential stakeholders. Leaders lead with integrity, without a fixation on the bottom line, coordination with the greater environment. Okay? There's culture. And Peter Drucker famously said that leaders' business is culture, and culture will eat strategy for lunch. Raj Sisodia says they'll eat strategy for breakfast. Okay, I think that's probably true today. Overarching focus of all business activity is the long-term thriving versus short-term quarterly results. And fundamentally, and this is why I wanted to make a point out of, what am I good at? I'm good at creating and maintaining long-term relationships. My oldest business client I've been working with for 27 years. And the average is around 12. And it's not because I keep selling them stuff. Some of the clients I work with are on a pro bono basis now that I've been working with for a long time. It's about relationship, and that's all an organization is. All a business is a collection of people that are in relationship, period. Now, they may be in relationship around a common focus, ideally, but essentially they're in relationship most obviously with each other. But they're also in relationship with jobs, their goals, their objectives, their work processes, values and vision, personal, all of these things, anything that I interact with has a relational dynamic to it. And to the degree that relationships work well, the organization's got a pretty good shot at being successful. If the organizational relationships aren't functioning well, all bets are off. So having a focus, and this is really a fundamental focus, I think, of compassionate capitalism, is that there's an overarching focus on relational dynamics, the quality of the relationships that we have and that we hold to be sacred. And business is the most pervasive force on the planet today. And if it started paying attention to relationship quality as opposed to fiscal return, it could be a very interesting world. Stakeholders. We've got all kinds of stakeholders. Shareholders, by the way, are the least contributory stakeholder in any organization. They contribute less than any other stakeholder group to the success of the organization. Now, they contribute, obviously, investment capital, but in terms of the day-to-day operation, all the other stakeholders have a far greater sway in what's going on. Okay? The shareholders have the greatest voice, typically, and the default, and you won't find this in case law, but there is nothing that says that the shareholder rights have a prerogative. Now, charter tells you to pay attention to it as a management group, okay? And there's some stuff that kind of goes on around that. But yeah, it's very difficult to find it codified. What if, when you're making decisions, there were no trade-offs? You just took trade-offs as a starting point in the conversation off the table. You have to then pay attention to the quality of the relationships. How are they going to feel if we do this? How are we going to feel if we do that? What's necessary here? Compassion. Where do I meet you? Okay? Charles Schwab, when they, during the fiscal calamity here about 4 years ago, had to lay some folks off. Interesting thing that they did was they gave share options to everyone that they laid off, with the bet that if we come back as a company, because we're laying you off because we can't afford it right now, when we come back, you're going to reap the benefit of it. Okay? And no trade-offs. Hard decisions, but no trade-offs. Raj Sisodia, great guy, wrote the book, Firms of Endearment. Here are some companies that are actually paying attention to this. And he also wrote with John Mackey, Conscious Capitalism, and it's a fascinating read. Some of the companies that are considered firms of endearment. And these firms pay attention to values like love, They pay attention to relationships. They pay attention to trust. They pay attention to a different core set of values than what typical companies pay attention to. And the interesting thing about what happens, Standard & Poor stock returns 1996 through 2011. Jim Collins wrote the book Good to Great, best-selling business book in history. These are the companies that were represented by them. These are the firms of endearment companies as an aggregate. Stock return. There is a reason from a fiscal point of view that you might want to pay attention to love as a value. Yeah, it does get quantified in a very positive way. Now, bringing this home. How am I doing on time? Sliding in there. Okay. Core questions. What does it mean to run a business exceptionally well? And what does it mean to attend to the greatest social good? Okay? So think about your company, the way that you run your company. What does it mean to run it exceptionally well in this new model, just in the way that I framed it? How would you run your, if at all differently, how would you run it differently? And if you were running it specifically to attend to the greatest social good, how would you allocate resources? How would you work with what you're doing? Okay? Just kind of think about that for a moment, because the other questions I'd like you to consider here are these. What if money had a use-by date? If the old model has accumulation as its underlying premise, make it impossible to have value in accumulation. Yeah, I don't care what the use-by date is, but if you started practicing just as an individual, my money has a use-by date. Just pretend that that $100 bill will be worth 0 in 5 years. What you're going to spend it on? How are you going to, your 401k, it's got a use-by date. How are you going to allocate those resources for the greatest social good? Running your business well, how would you, that's a resource. Corporations had an expiry date, kind of going back to the beginning here. As far as I can tell, the only two things on this planet right now that don't die are money and corporations. And that's an unnatural state. Everything has a shelf life, even a Hostess Twinkie. Okay? And this is one of the things that we're going to be having conversations with, the Just Capital Group, Social Venture Network, changing the metrics by how businesses are judged. And if we can get some GAT standards changed, general accounting principles, what are we measuring for success? Richard talked about that in his video. So, just going back here to these questions, turn to your partner real quick and take only about a minute and a half, which will give you 45 seconds apiece. Just comment on this. What do you think that this means for you as an individual? And then I'm going to come back to the last piece here. Yeah, perfect. About 1 more minute. Okay, that was a quick minute. I've just been, okay. Thank you, partner. They're waving a timesheet at me here, so. All right. Any insights here? Anything just kind of pop up as you started exploring this very briefly? Yeah. Brad?
Everybody wins.
Everybody wins. Yeah. Yep. Novel thought.
That's the same thing. The two phrases that mean the same thing.
Yep. Yep. Same coin, different sides. Yeah. Okay. Did that one already. Here's what I want to wrap with. What if I told you that the future of business is making the future its business?
Yes.
And if you're not doing this, you're soon going to be out of business. That's where I want you to leave thinking tonight, is how am I running my business? This story gets shaped or reshaped by each one of us individually beginning to do something. We all work with an incredible cohort out there, and we have a power to make some big shifts in this story. We don't have to necessarily do things differently in our interaction as long as we hold a different consciousness around what we do. And the consciousness is where it begins. And from my position, the idea of compassion preceding consciousness makes a big difference. So, as you go forth and conquer, do it with compassion. Yeah, that would be the charter here. So, I want to thank you for this. Compassionate Capitalism. On time. Thanks.